Welcome back to Meat Market Minutes. We're here for our first quarter of 2021 video series, and we've got a group of economists from around the Southeast that we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the meat market in general. And this morning we're going to have David Anderson, who's from Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, talk to us a little bit about what's going on in the pork market. So go ahead and take it away, David.
Thanks, Justin. I'm pretty lucky to draw pork this time. I love talking about pork. Let's jump right into some things going on in the pork market. One of the things that I find that we have going on right now is really surging prices. Prices sharply increasing, and what I'm going to show here is just the pork cutout value. If we think about the kind of the value at wholesale of all the cuts off the hog, and you can see on the chart that this thing is really surging higher. We've gone from about 78 to almost $95 per hundredweight just in the course of this year so far, well above where we were last year. And we're right on the cusp of a year ago really starting the effects of the pandemic and the shutdowns in restaurants and things like that. And you can certainly see that volatility that occurred because of the pandemic in pork markets. And yet we see pork markets surging higher right now. I think it's really an interesting time in pork markets to take a look at what's going on and where we're headed, I think, the rest of the year. As economists, we might think, oh, you jab us with a sharp stick and we blurt out supply and demand. Well, in this case, we got sharply higher prices. We've got pork production that is roughly where we were a year ago, although the trend is for declining production so far this year. But we're producing plenty of pork and we have sharply higher prices going on. I think we've got some interesting things happening in the market in terms of our expectations for the rest of the year. I might also point out again that sharp decline in production as the pandemic took over last year. And so we're almost to that point. So, it's pretty clear that in the second quarter of this year, we're going to have more pork production than we did last year. But that's because we're comparing to the decline in production due to the pandemic. So you might think we got plenty of pork on the market. What's going on with prices? One of the things I think is going on in prices is that we have been shrinking our breeding herd. If we look at the number of sows going to market that are going out of the production complex, through late last year, we moved a lot of sows to slaughter. We were rapidly reducing the hog herd because we were unprofitable. We had sharply increasing feed costs. We had relatively low hog prices. And so we've been shrinking the breeding herd. If we look at this year so far, we're starting to turn that around. The much higher prices in the wholesale market, which are also reflected in higher prices in the hog market, we've returned to some hopes of profitability and some higher prices projected out later this year, which is leading us to rapidly tamp down that sow slaughter because we want to put those back in the breeding herd to produce more pork. And so, I would point that out as an area where we're right in the middle of this changeover from reducing our breeding herd to growing the herd. If you look at the number of sows kept for breeding, that has certainly declined from its peak that we had just a few quarters ago. And so if we take a look at that, our hog herd's been going down, so we might have some expectations for tighter supplies coming up in the rest of the year. But if we look at producers' intentions, hog farmers and companies' intentions for farrowings this year, we intend to, producers reported they intend to farrow a larger percentage of the available sow herd. So we've got some mixed signals going on in the marketplace, but certainly these prices are moving us back towards some hopes of profitability in terms of hog production and some growing production later, even though we might think we've got some tighter supplies right now. We often talk about cold storage stocks and some of these meat items. Throughout the pork complex, we've got sharply less pork in cold storage, which has some effects, particularly if we think about hams, we think about pork bellies, which produce bacon. If we look at those higher prices across the board, I'm going to show about 3 different selected cuts. If we're interested in hams, we've got some surging ham prices as well, well above where we were a year ago. And again, I think with some relatively tight supplies going on, we might think of ham prices probably being above where they were a year ago for some time to come, but also highly volatile. Hams are one of those, I think, items that we see a lot of price volatility in. And so I tend to expect some higher prices on average and also some volatile prices as well, as we work through some kind of tight supplies, some tight cold storage supplies as well. Trimmings, if you like sausage like I do, pork trimmings are important in any type of our kinds of all our wide variety of sausages that are out there, and ground pork products. I want to take you back to a chart I showed earlier with sharply falling sow slaughter. That typically goes along with surging pork trimming prices, the trimmings that go into making sausage. And we've got sharply increasing trimmings prices. And so if you're interested in sausage products, ground pork products, I think we got some higher wholesale ingredient prices going on that are going to lead into some price pressures on that part of the market. If those are the stuff you really like I do. I'm going to show you one more, and that's pork bellies. I think pork bellies have sort of been my poster child for price volatility in livestock and meat markets over the last number of years. And you see surging pork belly prices again. Now, remember, bellies are what we make bacon out of. And bacon is one of those really interesting phenomenons in meat markets where we've had growing demand. We slap bacon on everything, and that's nothing new in meat markets, but continues today. And so if we look right now, we always see in the pork belly market companies stockpiling in anticipation of price changes. We've got some very low stocks right now. With production roughly even with where we are a year ago, we've got some higher prices. And so again, I expect some highly volatile prices as companies deplete those stocks, buy back in to build stocks, and the price ramifications of that as well. So again, if you're a big fan of bacon, we might see some price pressures on the bacon side, on the belly side as well. Overall in the pork market, I think we're headed for some higher and more volatile prices. We certainly see higher prices in the spot market today. On the other side of that, we've certainly got higher feed costs in the whole kind of feed complex of what we feed hogs. That has led us, I think, to some of this reduction in the breeding herd, which has led to higher prices, and now we're reacting to that. So the path of feed costs, I think, going through this year are pretty important on our perspective production and prices. I think falling sow slaughter is pretty important as well. That will lead to increased farrowings, increased hog production, and increased pork production. I didn't show a chart of it, but exports are key here. Our export markets have been very robust on the pork side. We've been shipping more pork, particularly to China. And it relates to this longer term phenomenon of African swine fever that has decimated their herds, yet they're in the process of trying to rebuild. And they get some more incidences of that disease. Yet the rebuilding process is going on, and really the path of that rebuilding of their hog herds, as the largest hog producer in the world and largest pork consumer around as well, the path of that rebuilding, I think, likely will have some impact on our prices longer term over the next year or so. But certainly our exports have been booming, and so when I mentioned pork production roughly even with a year ago, with higher exports, we likely have had some tighter supplies on our domestic market simply because of that trade dynamic going on. And so, I think this is a really interesting market as to where we are right now. And I think a fair amount of market uncertainty among various market analysts about where we're headed in terms of pork production throughout the rest of the year. We've got some with higher pork production. Yeah, we've also got some that would view those farrowing rates and some uncertainty between farrowings as a percent of the breeding herd, and a large number of sows that went to market over the last several months is probably indicative of some much tighter pork supplies. So I'm going to close with just one thing. This is something I did for Super Bowl weekend. In addition to my chicken wings, we did some pork belly burn-ins out on the Big Green Egg. These things turned out great. And, seeing whole, uncured, uncut pork bellies in our grocery stores has been something that's, I think, a relatively new thing in the last year or so. So this was my first attempt at some pork belly burn-ins, and I thought they turned out great. And so with that delicious picture, that's it for me and my pork meat market minutes.
Thanks, David. That was great. That's a solid picture. Does anyone have any questions for David?
Yeah. So David, first off, I agree with you. This is seeing whole slabs of pork belly in the meat counters is a new phenomenon here too, and I think it's getting a lot of interest. But I think what's common across a lot of this is higher feed costs, right? We're seeing it across the board. Is there a sense that this culling of sows is going to continue, given there's no real indication of, grain prices decreasing anytime soon? And what do you think is there maybe a trigger point on, what grain prices have to get to before we start seeing more culling?
Well, I think, so much culling has happened already in the breeding herd that driving those prices higher is offsetting the feed costs. And I think if we looked out at some futures market expectations of pork prices, I think that turns the corner on where we go in terms of sow slaughter. Sow slaughter's dropped dramatically, which really means, we've already done a bunch of that culling, and folks are turning around to already turn that corner, even in the face of these high feed costs. And I think of high feed costs also as, that really is the market signal to plant a lot more acres. And so to me, my expectation is certainly we're going to plant a lot more acres of corn and soybean. And so what happens in the growing season then becomes key to, we see what happens this fall with another surge of prices on the feed cost side that could cause some more. But, if you factor in, some pretty large acres and trend yields, you get a lot of production. And, I think we got to figure that our competitors in those markets are going to plant more acres too. And so, we might, if we could be proactive, we might want to plan, we might see some planning here to ramp up in anticipation of some lower prices later as well.
I'm going to read the group something and see what David's thoughts are. See what y'all think this is. Saucy, tangy, tender, and shamelessly delicious. That is the advertisement for the nationwide push for the McRib, which came out October 30th of 2020. There are rumors abounding in, national media about why and when the McRib comes out. You have any thoughts or comments or ideas?
I'll say this, that, the McRib is there's some devoted followers of the McRib out there, and they wait for that sucker to come out. But it's not unusual for, when they're going to roll out something like that, it takes a lot of planning beforehand to have the supplies already built in. You've already got contracted supplies of pork that go into that product. But it's not the first time we've seen large chains like that. They roll out a product and it has an effect on market prices. We've looked at some of that in terms of like Arby's brisket sandwiches and some things like that, where they're using a particular cut, and it changes the price relationship between different cuts. And so, the rollout of that thing, and usually it's a limited time deal, right? But the rollout of the McRib, that certainly boosts some pork demand, I think. But for the most part, those things are pretty well planned too. The one I know where they just ran out of product was the big chicken wars, right? The chicken sandwich wars. Was that last year, 2020? I mean, the pandemic has got me, I can't tell one month from the next.
The chicken war is still ongoing. And McDonald's just released their chicken sandwich.
A spicy chicken sandwich.
KFC's got a chicken sandwich, new revamped chicken sandwich, and then.
But if I remember right, Jordan, the war heated up so much that didn't Popeyes run out?
Yes,
it was so
their spicy chicken
they ran out of what they had contracted for to make that product, and so the role in specific cuts of big restaurant chains like that is something we've seen in other cuts as well as the McRib.
Hey, Dr. Anderson, I have a question. Going back to an uncured belly being offered at a retail marketplace, do you think that the product variation that we're seeing is here to stay, or do you think in the future, seeing an uncured belly is not going to be there anymore?
Oh, I think it's going to be there. I think, it gets to a broader picture of people, and the kind of one of the classic economic demand shifters, right, is changes in tastes and preferences. I think, that's one of the interesting thing in meat markets to me is the unpredictability of people and their new idea. My gosh, let's do this pork belly thing. And pork bellies show up not only all of us, home smokers, but a whole bunch of Asian cuisines that have really ramped up in interest use pork belly. And so we've got, there is a segment of consumers, of folks that want to try new stuff. And I think we see that show up in our grocery stores. And I think pork belly is a great example of that, where it's changes in tastes and preferences. It's consumers wanting to try something new. And to me, that's one of the really interesting things and unpredictable things in meat markets that make doing some of this work kind of fun, is that we get stuff like that happening. And I don't think that's going to go away.
Very good. Well, do you want to have a last question? If not, we'll go ahead and wrap this up, and we'll see y'all on the next video. Thanks for joining us.